The year was 1533 and a woman was sitting in a gilded throne room inside the Tower of London, not yet knowing that the man who had dismantled an entire church to make her queen would within 3 years sign her death warrant. If you think you already know this story, you are wrong. What Henry VIII actually did to his 6 wives has been buried under 5 centuries of romantic myth, Tudor propaganda, and the deliberate erasure of uncomfortable truths, and by the end of this you will understand the single mechanism he used to destroy every woman he married. Not passion, not temper, not the volatile rage of a man who could not control himself. A system, cold, legal, precise, and patient, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Start with Catherine of Aragon because her story is where the machine was first assembled and tested, and because understanding what happened to her is the only way to understand everything that came after. Catherine had been a loyal, dutiful wife for 24 years when Henry decided she was no longer useful, and what followed was not the act of a man in love with someone new, but the calculated move of a king who needed to establish absolute authority over the church, the nobility and the law all at once. He didn't simply abandon Catherine or seek a divorce in any recognisable sense. He legally erased their marriage, entirely declaring it had never been valid, which meant Catherine was not a divorced queen, but a woman who had never been queen at all, and their daughter, Mary, was reclassified overnight from legitimate princess to bastard, stripped of her title, her household, her precedence, and her access to her mother. Think carefully about the psychological architecture of that move, because Henry did not imprison Catherine. He did not execute her. He simply legally redefined her out of existence, forcing her to spend her final years in cold, damp manor houses without her title, without contact with her daughter, without the legal identity she had held for a quarter century. When Catherine refused to accept the new reality and continued signing her letters as Queen Henry used even that act of dignity as evidence of her defiance and tightened her confinement further. When she died alone at Kimbleton Castle in January 1536, Henry wore yellow to celebrate and hosted a banquet. That single detail should reframe everything you think you know about this man. This was not complicated grief or difficult emotion. This was a king announcing to his entire court that a woman who had been his wife for 24 years had been successfully deleted from the official record of his life, and he was pleased about it. The machine had worked. Now it would be refined. Anne Boleyn is where the machine revealed its true efficiency and its true ruthlessness. Anne had been the reason Henry dismantled the entire Catholic Church in England, creating a rupture in Western Christianity that still exists today, and yet within 3 years of their marriage he needed her gone. And what followed was not a crime of passion, but a bureaucratic execution dressed in the language of justice. Thomas Cromwell, acting on Henry's need, constructed a case of adultery and high treason against Anne, using confessions extracted under torture from men in her court, and the charges were almost certainly fabricated, because the specific dates listed in the indictment placed Anne committing adultery at locations where court records confirmed she was documented to be elsewhere on those exact days. But the fabrication was never really the point. The point was legal cover and speed. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were arrested, tried and executed alongside her, and Anne herself was beheaded on Tower Green on the 19th of May 1536, just 11 days after formal charges were announced, giving her almost no time to mount any meaningful defence. Henry was publicly betrothed to Jane Seymour the very next morning. The interval between signing his wife's death warrant and announcing his engagement to the next woman was less than 24 hours, and that timeline is not the behaviour of a grieving man who reluctantly accepted a painful truth. It is the behaviour of someone who had been planning the transition for months. And there is one detail that reveals just how total the machine's power actually was. On the day Anne was arrested, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who owed his entire career to Anne's influence, annulled her marriage to Henry. Not after her execution, before it. Anne Boleyn was declared to have never been legally married to Henry while she was still alive and waiting for her beheading. She was erased legally before she was erased physically, and that sequence was deliberate because it meant that when the axe fell, it fell on a woman who, according to English law, did not exist. Jane Seymour is the wife. History most often calls the one Henry truly loved, and she holds that position in the mythology precisely because she died before he had the opportunity to destroy her. Jane gave Henry his only legitimate surviving son, Edward, in October 1537, and died 12 days later from complications following childbirth. Henry mourned her, publicly wore black for months, and kept her portrait in his chambers until his own death. This has been interpreted as evidence of deep love, and the love was probably genuine, but the more honest interpretation is that Jane's death preserved her as the perfect wife simply because she never lived long enough to fail him, or to develop inconvenient opinions, or to become politically difficult. Every wife who survived long enough to have a full personality became a problem. Jane never got that far, and Henry got to mourn her without ever having to manage her, and the memorial he built for her was constructed entirely on her absence. Anne of Cleves is the wife history remembers as the one Henry found ugly and dismissed as a great Flanders mare, but the real story is considerably more revealing. Henry had agreed to the marriage in late 1539, based on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein, and when Anne arrived in England, the gap between the painted image and the actual woman jarred him so badly he immediately began looking for an exit. Anne was by every other account a dignified, intelligent, gracious woman who had done nothing wrong, except fail to match the fantasy Henry had constructed around her portrait. But here is the detail that collapses the romantic version of this story entirely. On the same day that Thomas Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill for arranging the Cleves match, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. The man who had served Henry for a decade, who had built the legal machinery that destroyed Anne Boleyn, lost his head on the same morning his king was exchanging wedding vows. Cromwell sent a letter begging for mercy. Henry never replied. The machine had simply found a new operator and discarded the old one with the same efficiency it discarded wives. Anne of Cleves herself cooperated fully with the annulment, accepted the title of the king's sister, received generous settlements, and quietly withdrew from court. She was the only one of the 6 wives to outlive Henry, dying peacefully in 1557, and her survival is its own lesson about what the machine actually rewarded, which was not loyalty or virtue or love, but the complete and immediate surrender of any claim to be treated as a full person. Catherine Howard was likely 17 or 18 years old when she first caught Henry's attention, and she had been placed deliberately in his path by the conservative Howard faction at court, who wanted to use a beautiful young relative to gain political influence over the aging king. Catherine had no meaningful agency in any of this because refusing the king's interest was not a realistic option for a teenage girl whose powerful relatives were engineering her ascent. Henry, who was now nearly 50 years old, morbidly obese, and suffering from a chronically infected leg wound that caused him constant pain, became obsessed with her youth and energy, and called her his rose without a thorn. Within 18 months of their marriage, evidence surfaced of relationships she had formed before the marriage, and Henry wept publicly and dramatically, and then signed her death warrant, and she was executed on Tower Green in February 1542. The detail that has survived in the historical record is this. On the night before her execution, Catherine asked for the execution block to be brought to her chamber so she could practice placing her head on it correctly, because she was terrified of dying badly in front of the watching crowd, and she wanted to get it right. A teenage girl alone in a stone room the night before her death, rehearsing the position of her own neck on a block of wood, because she was afraid of embarrassing herself in front of the people who had come to watch her die. That is not Tudor drama or royal scandal. That is what it actually cost to be a young woman inside a system that had been built to extract everything from you and discard the rest. Catherine Parr survived Henry not through fortune, but through a sustained performance of self-erasure under conditions of constant mortal threat. By the time Henry married her in 1543, Catherine had watched what the machine did to every woman before her, and she was herself a twice-widowed, intelligent, reformist woman with genuine theological opinions, which made her exactly the kind of person the machine was designed to destroy. In 1546, Henry actually signed a warrant for her arrest based on her Protestant views, and a copy of that warrant was accidentally dropped near her rooms, and Catherine learned about it before it could be executed. Rather than flee or confront Henry, she sought him out immediately and told him she had only ever discussed theology with him to distract him from his physical pain and to learn from his superior wisdom. Henry cancelled the warrant, embraced her, and called her a perfect comfort. What Catherine did in that conversation was not diplomacy. She looked at a man who had signed her arrest warrant and reconstructed herself in real time into whatever shape would make him feel powerful enough to let her live. She erased her own opinions, her own intellect, her own convictions in a single exchange and offered the erasure as a gift. And it worked. And the fact that it worked tells you exactly what the machine was ultimately built to produce, which was women who had learned to make themselves smaller than they actually were in order to survive the proximity of a man who could not tolerate the full weight of their existence. Catherine outlived Henry by 1 year, but what she paid to survive him was the very thing she actually was. What you have just moved through is not 6 separate stories. It is one story told 6 times with the same mechanism operating underneath every iteration. Catherine of Aragon, reclassified from queen to never having been queen, Anne Boleyn erased legally before she was erased physically. Jane Seymour preserved in memory only because death arrived before disappointment could. Anne of Cleves dismissed the moment reality failed to match a portrait. Catherine Howard destroyed for a past she had no power to undo. Catherine Parr saved only by dismantling herself in a single conversation. The machine worked not because Henry was a monster in any simple sense, but because the entire legal, religious and social architecture of Tudor England made what he did not just possible but legitimate. The church said he was God's representative on earth. The law said what he signed was justice. The court celebrated what he celebrated. And the women inside that system had almost no language with which to name what was being done to them, let alone resist it. 6 women, 30 years, one machine, and understanding exactly how it worked here is one of the clearest ways to understand how it works anywhere. If you want to see more buried truths about how power really operated throughout history, subscribe to VIII History and drop a comment below telling me which of the 6 wives you think history has most misunderstood.